I've been asked to say a few words, and I'll try to keep it to a few words, on the occupation, just meaning the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and I'll keep to that, omit the Golan Heights, separate but important issue. Just to let you know where I stand on the matter, so no confusion. I think there is a possibility now of a diplomatic settlement, pretty much in accord with what has been a very long-standing and extremely broad international consensus since the mid-1970s, namely a two-state settlement on the recognized international border with minor modifications. That has not been possible for one reason, because the United States has been blocking it since the mid-1970s and continues to block it, but that much is in our hands, so that could change. About 2/3 of the population supports it, but has no effect on policy. The one formulation of that, there are various formulations of this proposal. One of them, the most reasonable one on the table, I think, is the so-called Geneva Accords being discussed in Geneva right now. Most of the relevant countries have lent support to it. The U.S. is notable by its absence, as usual. In my view, this is, I'm not suggesting it's a wonderful agreement. I don't think it is. I think it's the least unpleasant of the realistic alternatives, at least for the short term. Maybe it can lead to something better later on. But that's just so you know where I stand, and you can triangulate as you like. I will review briefly, that's all I'll do, in fact, some of the steps leading up to this. For many of you, this should be familiar. In fact, for everyone, it should be something you learn about in elementary school. So I apologize for saying things that should be at least well known, and would be if we valued our freedom, but unfortunately are not well known, in fact, barely known. So let me quickly review. As I said, by occupied territories, I will refer to, take as a starting point, the effective international border as it was settled in 1949. That border, what's called the Green Line, divides the Palestinian state that was recommended at the UN resolution 2 years earlier. It divides it roughly in two, almost exactly in two. Half of it was taken over by Israel. That part is called Israel, and it's not under contention. The other half was taken over by Jordan. That's what's called the West Bank, and that's the part that's under contention. So that partition is essentially finished as far as the international community is concerned, and it's not debated. The border stayed that way until Israel invaded in 1956, but was compelled by the U.S. to withdraw. In 1967, Israel again invaded, this time with U.S. support, and conquered the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. That's the situation as it is now. What I'm referring to now as the occupied territories, again, are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In November 1967, the Security Council accepted a U.S.-initiated resolution, UN 242, which called for a settlement on the international border on the Green Line, in the U.S. official version, with minor and mutual adjustments, but essentially on the Green Line, so maybe straighten out a curved border or something like that. That was the U.S. position. It was adopted by essentially the world. Notice that resolution was completely rejectionist. It said nothing about Palestinian rights. They're not mentioned. The only reference to Palestinians is a vague allusion to unspecified rights of refugees. That remained, at that time, in 1967, the resolution was, it called essentially for peace, full peace treaty in return for full withdrawal, minor modifications and mutual ones. Israel rejected the withdrawal. The major Arab states rejected peace. Things were at a standstill until 1971, when Egypt broke the ice by offering Israel a full peace treaty, a complete peace treaty in terms of official U.S. policy, in return not for withdrawal but for partial withdrawal, that is, withdrawal from Egyptian territory. The Egyptian offer said nothing about the West Bank, about the Palestinians, the Golan Heights. It said in return for withdrawal from Egyptian territory, Egypt would accept a full peace treaty. Egypt is the major military force in the Arab world. With Egypt out of the conflict, the military aspect of the conflict would have essentially been over. Israel understood that we have a lot of Israeli internal documents from the period, some of them secret then, some public, and they're consistent. They understood that there could be full peace at this point and integration into the region, but Israel decided to reject the offer because they preferred expansion. Expansion at that time meant into the Sinai. That was the crucial area. Israel was a labor government. Golda Meir labor government was expanding into the northeast Sinai, from which thousands of farmers had been expelled, driven into the desert behind barbed wire, their towns, mosques, and so on, leveled in preparation for the building of an all-Jewish city called Yamit, which was a major project at the time. The crucial question was how the United States would react. As always, the United States is what one astute Israeli commentator, one of their major political commentators, really recently described as the boss man called partner, which is essentially accurate. So the question is how the boss man called partner would react. The boss man had an internal debate. It was won by Henry Kissinger, and the U.S. government decided to abandon its former position and accept Israel's position, and to follow what Kissinger called a policy of stalemate. Stalemate means no negotiations, just force. That ended the Egyptian initiative. Actually, Egypt continued to put it forward in every way it could. The President Sadat of Egypt, who had initiated it, warned repeatedly that if Israel continued expanding into the Sinai with U.S. backing, he would go to war. In his phrase, Yamit means war. Nobody took him very seriously. It was a period of enormous triumphalism in both Israel and the United States. Egypt was assumed to be a basket case, and it was just disregarded. In 1973, to everyone's astonishment, Egypt did go to war, and to everyone's greater astonishment, turned out to be militarily highly successful. It was a very close thing for Israel, in fact, for the world. The United States declared a nuclear alert, and it was pretty tense could have been a superpower conflict, meaning the end. At that point, Kissinger recognized that Egypt can't simply be dismissed, and he initiated what was called his shuttle diplomacy, moving up and back and trying to arrange some sort of ceasefire. Without going through the details, that led finally to the Camp David agreements of 1978, in which the United States and Israel accepted Sadat's 1971 offer. Except that at that point, the offer was much less acceptable to the U.S. and Israel than it would have been in 1971, because by then the Palestinian issue was on the table. So the new Sadat offer in 1978 was that Egypt would make peace with Israel if Israel withdrew from Egyptian territory, Sinai, and also recognized Palestinian rights. That was new, not in 1971. The way this is described in the United States, it's called, and in fact in the West, thanks to the power of U.S. propaganda, it's described as a diplomatic triumph of the United States. In fact, President Carter just got a Nobel Peace Prize for it recently. Actually, it was a diplomatic catastrophe for the United States. It was an acceptance of a harsher version, from their point of view, of an offer that was on the table in 1971, which Washington had rejected, leading to a major war almost destruction, years of tragedy and torture, and finally the U.S. Came around and accepted it. But history is written by the victors and the powerful. It doesn't necessarily have much relationship to what happened. You can check and see if you agree that that's what happened. And there's not really any controversy. The documentary record is very straightforward. By 1978, as I mentioned, by 1978, the Palestinian issue was on the table. That reached the international agenda in 1976, January 1976, when the Security Council debated a resolution calling for a political settlement on the international border, but now different from UN 242 because it called for a Palestinian state in the territories that Israel would evacuate, the West Bank and Gaza. There was a very broad international support for that, supported by all the Arab states, major Arab states, by the PLO, in fact, pretty much by the whole world. The U.S. vetoed it. A U.S. veto typically is a double veto. It doesn't happen, and it's vetoed from history. So you have to work hard to find out about it. That was the first overt U.S. step to block the international consensus, which still persists. Same international consensus, same blocking. Well, I won't run through the rest of the record, but from that point until the present, the United States has continued to intervene unilaterally, vetoing Security Council resolutions, voting against similar General Assembly resolutions, usually alone. Alone means with Israel, sometimes with the Marshall Islands or someone else who's picked up, but essentially unilaterally, and has also blocked all other initiatives. There have been a whole series of diplomatic initiatives, all blocked by Washington. That continues to the present. In 1991, just to move to the next step in the diplomacy, after the first Gulf War, the U.S. felt that it was in a position to, it had made it clear in the First Gulf War that the U.S. was going to dominate that region by force. Everybody else understood, everybody backed off. The U.S. was in a position to ram through its own unilateral agreement, so it assumed. The Madrid conference right after the Gulf War was called to institute the U.S. position. There was, however, a snag. There was an authentic Palestinian delegation headed by the most respected figure in the occupied territories, Haider Abdel Shafi, a conservative nationalist, honest, renowned for his integrity and highly respected, and he simply refused to go along. He headed the Palestinian negotiation team, and they simply refused to accept the U.S.-Israeli demand that a political settlement, permit continued U.S.-backed Israeli moves to settle and integrate as much of the occupied territories as they wanted. That was the point on which the negotiations blocked. We got around that thanks to the Palestinian leadership outside Palestine. It's called the Tunis leadership, the PLO and Yasser Arafat, who decided to undercut the Palestinian negotiating team and agree to a political arrangement which would permit continued Israeli settlement. That means U.S.-funded and backed Israeli settlement in the occupied territories and further integration, building infrastructure, and so on. That was called the Oslo Agreement, highly praised here. Grand meeting on the White House lawn, the day of awe, according to the Boston Globe. If you read the terms of the Oslo Agreement, the Declaration of Principles, it was completely obvious what was happening. The terms did refer to UN 242, but they left out all other UN resolutions which called for Palestinian national rights. Remember, UN 242 is completely rejectionist, nothing about the Palestinians. So the Declaration of Principles described the permanent settlement, the long-term settlement that they were going to reach, as based solely on UN 242, hence offering nothing to the Palestinians. and there was nothing in it about any bar to continued U.S.-backed Israeli settlement and integration programs in the occupied territories. The Palestinians did have a role. The Palestinian Authority was set up. Its role, as Prime Minister Rabin pointed out with great pleasure, was its role would be to control the Palestinian population by force and violence and terror. It could be as brutal as it wanted, as corrupt as it wanted. Didn't matter as long as it kept the Palestinians under control. As Rabin put it in his usual gentle way, they would be able to control the Palestinians without concern for human rights organizations, the Israeli High Court, mothers and fathers who don't like what's happening, what their children are doing, and so on and so forth. Standard colonial procedure. It's very familiar in the history of colonialism. The imperial colonies are almost always run by collaborators, not by the imperial country. Collaborators run the political system, run security forces. One of the shocking things about the American occupation of Iraq is that it hasn't been able to duplicate, amazingly, what almost every military occupation does quite easily. Very surprising. Anyway, that was the role of the Palestinian Authority. So things continued through the 1990s with continued steady Israeli, U.S.-backed Israeli settlement and development programs. The year 2000, the last Clinton-Barak year, actually had the highest level of settlement since before the Oslo agreements. It was continuing steadily and in fact increasing. And that's the core, has been the core of the territorial problem. There are other problems, but keeping just to the occupation, it's a territorial issue, and that's the core of it. Camp David, there was another Camp David meeting in summer of 2000 where proposals were made. They were very highly praised in the United States as extremely magnanimous and generous and marvelous offer, which the Palestinians turned down because they want to kill all the Jews or something like this. There's a very easy way to test that thesis, which was essentially unanimous in U.S. Journalism and commentary. The easy way to test the thesis is to look at a map. It seems obvious. If it's a magnanimous, generous offer, then the map ought to show it. Well, that's not so easy, it turns out, because no one has been able to find a single map in the entire U.S. media. It's not that they were hard to find. I mean, they're available in the standard scholarly sources, which the press and commentators use when they want to. They were there in the Israeli press. They were there in critical literature. If you came to talks of mine and others, we described the maps. So they were there. They just weren't presented. The reason why they weren't presented is that it's pretty clear when you look at them. The generous offer broke the West Bank into essentially 3 separated cantons, a northern, central, and southern one, divided from one another by Israeli settlement and huge infrastructure projects. All 3 of them pretty much separated, virtually separated from a small part of Jerusalem, the 4th West Bank canton. That's traditionally the center of Palestinian commercial, cultural life, health services, and so on. So 4 West Bank enclaves separated from Gaza, the future of which was unclear. So that's what many mainstream Israeli commentators rightly called a kind of a Bantustan settlement, referring to the South African model, which was in fact a conscious model, I should say. Magnanimous from some points of view, not from others. Just to be fair to Clinton and Barak, one should say that it was a considerable improvement over the existing situation. The existing situation was that Gaza was split into 3 separate regions, 3 separate Palestinian cantons, and the West Bank was separated into 227 cantons, little areas, some a few square kilometers, basically closed off. And this was going to improve it to 4 cantons in the West Bank and presumably 1 in Gaza. So it was an improvement. It's worth remembering that 227 and 3, because the current roadmap, of the quartet, it's usually called the U.S. roadmap, calls for, out in the distance sometime, a return to the status quo as of 2000. So therefore, it's interesting to remember what the status quo was in 2000. 227 Palestinian cantons in the West Bank and 3 in Gaza. That obviously wasn't going to go anywhere. However, negotiations did continue. After the Intifada broke out shortly after, negotiations continued in Taba, in Egyptian city in Taba, in 2001, in January. There were informal but high-level negotiations between Palestinian and Israeli negotiators, and they reached a tentative agreement, which is available if you're interested in the Israeli press and the European press. I don't think there's never seen any discussion of it in the United States, except again around the periphery, dissident literature. There's a detailed description of it by the European Union Observer, which is accurate. It was accepted by both sides, published in the mainstream Israeli press, and it's a clear improvement over the impossible Geneva Accords. There were still points of disagreement, territorial points about, Israeli salients breaking up the West Bank and so on, but it was a step towards a more equitable resolution of the territorial problem. Well, that was terminated. Those negotiations were terminated by Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak right before the Israeli elections. It was thought that that ended it. We've recently learned that the negotiations continued, and they lead up to the Geneva Accords. If you take a look at the Geneva Accords, again, here you can occasionally find something looking like a map. They are a considerable improvement over the Taba proposals, which were themselves a very substantial improvement over Camp David. You could look at the details. That's essentially what's on the table now. It could be, I think, to go back to where I started, the basis for a serious political settlement that would at least end the cycle of violence and maybe lay the basis for something better in the future. Is it just? No, it's not just. For one reason, Israel, incidentally, abandons nothing in the Geneva Accords, zero. To be precise, it abandons a little strip of territory along the Gaza Strip, which is not very important, and in return it takes over a piece of the West Bank. But it abandons nothing in the, that's to which it's legally entitled, at least. The Palestinians do abandon quite a bit. They abandon a stretch of the West Bank, and crucially, a large section of the Palestinians are not represented at all, namely the refugees. They're not part of these negotiations, and their rights are essentially dismissed, several million people. So, in terms of justice, probably you can make all kind of criticisms of it. I should say many old friends of mine and longtime associates have signed protests against it, which I don't agree with, because I think my own view again, and I'll stop with this, that of the realistic possibilities, it's about the only one that has any chance of being implemented. In some other universe, one could think of other things, but people who are suffering and miserable and tortured can't live with promises of some other universe. They have to have solutions in this universe, at least in my view. Anyhow, that's where things stand now and how they got there as I understand it. So let me stop and turn it to you.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I would like to now present Professor Chomsky with a traditional Jordanian headscarf as a token of our appreciation. Recently, people have been associating these headscarves with terrorists and terrorism. This is unfortunate, and we would hope to fight this stereotype and reassociate these headscarves with their true cultural significance. I would now like to open the floor for questions.
It's a long story. I've written a lot about it, so let me just refer you to what I've written, but and then I'll just briefly summarize. So I've been writing about it for 40 years as internal documents have been coming out, and we get a clearer picture of it. There's a summary, at least the way I understand it, in a book of mine that just came out a couple of weeks ago called Hegemony or Survival. One of the chapters is about this, and it reviews what I think the record shows. In brief, it seems to me it's roughly like this. In 1948, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the U.S. military, was very impressed with Israel's military prowess and described them as Israel as the most powerful military force in the Middle East, second only to Turkey. Turkey was really the base of U.S. power and remains so, the main military force. And they said, well, sooner or later, we might want to think about Israel as a base for U.S., part of the U.S. system of control. What the U.S. is concerned about in the Middle East is no secret. It has the world's major energy resources, period. If it wasn't for that, it could go down the tube. And when the oil is finished, it will go down the tube unless something is done. These are serious internal problems for the Arab world, I should say. But as far as the United States is concerned, what's important is to control the oil. The U.S. at that time, in the mid-40s, State Department described the Persian Gulf resources as what they called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, the most important area in the world for foreign investment. Not a small thing, kind of important, even more so today. And the method of control of the oil resources was essentially taken over from the British. British had been the primary imperial power. U.S. was a secondary player up until the Second World War. The British, and secondarily the French, mostly controlled that region. The British technique was to establish what they called an Arab facade. That meant weak, pliable governments which would control their own populations and behind the scenes, behind what the British called various constitutional fictions, like democracy and freedom and parliament and so on. Behind those constitutional fictions, the British would effectively rule. But the Arab facade would run it. Again, the standard imperial pattern. Pretty much what the U.S. is trying to institute in Iraq right now. It's almost copying the British model. France was a secondary power in the region. After the Second World War, the U.S. simply kicked France out on the legalistic grounds that France was an enemy country because it had been conquered by the Germans, and therefore its concessions were removed. You can do that if you're powerful. So France was kicked out. Britain was slowly reduced to the level of junior partner, and the U.S. took it over, but essentially with the British framework, Arab facades. The United States, however, introduced another level of control, what were called peripheral states, non-Arab states, which would be what the Nixon administration later called local cops on the beat. They were police headquarters would be in Washington, of course, and kind of a branch office in London, but the local cops on the beat would be the military powers around the Gulf region. One of them was Turkey. That was the main one, still the main one. Another was Iran. After they succeeded in overthrowing the parliamentary regime in Iran in 1953 and reinstituting a dictatorship, Iran was the second major cop on the beat. And the question was, Pakistan played a role, and the question was, would Israel be one of them? That's been the issue. Well, in 1958, there was a long step towards that. There was a very, I won't go into it in detail, but it was a very important year in the Middle East, and in fact in the world, 1958. Iraq broke out of the Anglo-American condominium. There was a military coup in Iraq, and it took over its own oil resources. There was deep concern in London and Washington. The British military base was Jordan, looked as if it was under threat. The U.S. sent military forces to Lebanon, apparently equipped with nuclear weapons. The concern was that Nasser of Egypt, who was the nationalist symbol, was influencing independent nationalism in the region. The only country in the region that offered any support to the U.S. and Britain at the time was Israel. Turkey, of course, but that's taken for granted. Turkey and Iran are taken for granted. But right in the region, Israel did offer some support. President Eisenhower and the National Security Council in 1958 internally concluded that, as they put it, a logical corollary of opposition to Arab nationalism is support for Israel as the only reliable base internal to the region, part of the periphery system. In 1967, that was just solidified. I mean, when Israel conquered, essentially it destroyed Nasser, who was the main concern of the U.S. And that was considered a great gift to U.S. power and to the facade. There was a defense of the oil monarchies against nationalism. And from then on, it's just continued. Israel's been regarded as what's called a strategic asset. In the early 70s, U.S. intelligence regarded the structure of the region, of U.S. power in the region, as based on a local tripartite alliance between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, with Turkey right in the background. Leading U.S. political figures who were concerned with the region, like Senator Jackson, expressed the same views. In 1959, the Shah was overthrown. Iran went off, became an enemy, and that just meant the role of Israel was more important. And in fact, the Israeli-Turkish alliance is extremely close. It was founded in 1958, a military alliance, that fateful year, and it's now Israel's strongest alliance after the United States, part of the whole framework of control. By now, Israel's become virtually a U.S. military base. It's got the most. It's a little country, small country, but it has extremely powerful military forces. It has hundreds of nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction. It's, according to its own military sources, its air and armored forces are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power outside the U.S. So it's no small thing. It's tightly linked to the United States in terms of its economy, kind of a high-tech, military-based economy, really closely interlinked with the U.S. It's coming to mimic the United States in other respects. It was at one point a relatively egalitarian, more or less social democratic society, kind of Scandinavian-type social democracy. That's all completely gone. It's now, like the United States, has the highest inequality in the industrial world after the United States. Social systems collapsing, like in the United States, and in other respects, it's becoming similar to the boss man called partner, not surprisingly. But I think that's the core of the issue. I mean, there are other things, there are other factors, but in my view, at least, that's been the core of it. Okay, so his very reasonable question is that I said before that I think the current Geneva Accords, as they're called, the ones under discussion in Geneva, are the least bad, or maybe the best, the best plan that can be implemented. Why did I have the opposite view about the Oslo agreements, Camp David and Taba? That's the question. Well, the reason is that these are the first agreements, the first proposals that do not institute effectively Bantustans in the occupied territories. The Oslo agreements in 1993 essentially offered the Palestinians nothing. As I mentioned, they didn't even mention Palestinian rights. And over the Oslo years, if you look at the successive agreements, again, I've written a lot about it, others have too, they simply institutionalized Israeli control over the occupied territories. When I say Israeli, I mean U.S.-backed Israeli. Israel can't do anything without U.S. backing. The Camp David Accords, as I mentioned, I think were a disaster. Taba agreements were somewhat better, but they still had those. They never resolved the issue. If you look at the Taba agreements, they never resolved the issue of the Israeli salients, the settlement salients that effectively broke the West Bank into three parts. It was left unresolved at the end of the Taba agreements. These proposals actually do offer a resolution. You can debate whether you like the resolution, but at least, it would lead to a territorial division that allows for a degree of independence, subsidiary independence, no doubt. All of these proposals establish what Ehud Barak's chief negotiator, Shlomo Ben-Ami, an Israeli academic, described as the goal of the Oslo Accords, namely a permanent neo-colonial dependency for the Palestinians. In one form or another, they all have that character. That's part of the injustice. But my view, that's at the moment, that's a fact of life. Until the United States and other international forces modify their position on this, I don't think anything more just can be attained. This is pretty much in our hands, incidentally. As I mentioned, the U.S. population, just to give you an indication of U.S. public opinion, which is rarely reported in the United States because it's too opposed to U.S. government policy, but the U.S. public is about 2/3 in favor of what's called the Saudi plan, which means total Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, none of this shenanigans around the border, in turn for peace. By a very substantial majority, also about 2-to-1, the public thinks that the United States ought to terminate aid to either of the two parties, either Israel or the Palestinians, which is not negotiating in good faith to achieve a political settlement. And if both parties are negotiating, the U.S. ought to equalize aid to them. Well, if any of you are familiar with the actual aid flow, I mean, this is a radical revision of U.S. policy. I mean, just a total revision of it. In fact, U.S. public opinion is so extreme on this matter that these facts can't even be reported, and they aren't. So even though they come from the major academic-based polling agency in the United States, program on international policy attitudes at University of Maryland, very detailed, in-depth studies, which are quoted when they give tolerable results, but not here. And in fact, that means that people who have these attitudes probably think they're isolated. They probably think I'm the only person in the country who believes this because you don't know that other people do. Well, all of that is important because it means there is a basis, a popular basis for developing political pressures that could lead to a political settlement, could shift U.S. unilateral rejection of even the Geneva Accords. But it has to be done. It's not going to happen by itself. Well, actually, I haven't read the book, and to tell you the honest truth, I haven't read anything of his since for the last 30 years, ever since he was publicly exposed, very publicly, in the Boston Globe, as a liar and a fraud and a fanatic opponent of civil rights. It's all in print. I can give it to you if you like, but since then I frankly haven't bothered. The question was, have I read Alan Dershowitz's book, and what do I think about what he said about me? And, all right, that was, as far as I was concerned, that was settled 30 years ago, and I haven't really bothered since. It's astonishing to me that he's able to survive the publication of what happened then. You can look at it if you like, but if you like, I'll describe it to you. The book itself, I've seen parts of because people sent me pieces, and it's just complete fraud. I mean, not even worth discussing. I don't like to give general comments without details in front of me, but if you can think of anything that ought to be commented on, I'd like to hear it. Yeah.
He especially attacked, or actually claims that he could use historians that you rely on, such as Morris, to disprove your points.
Yeah. Well, actually, he's referring to, it's interesting what he does there, at least what was sent to me. I assume what was sent to me by several people, including his associates, was accurate. It's all the same. He quotes something from a talk that I gave at Harvard about a year ago. He doesn't quote from the talk, which is about a totally different... First of all, quoting from a talk is already childish and ridiculous. Nobody does it, especially when a ton of material's in print. But he didn't quote from the talk. He quoted from the Q&A, which is even more ridiculous. He quoted a comment that I made about Benny Morris in the Q&A, which was, of course, from memory and wasn't part of the talk. Turns out the quote was almost a word-for-word paraphrase of what Morris actually said. Okay. So what he quoted was a comment of mine in informal Q&A referring to Benny Morris, and in fact, almost precise, so close to accurate, it could have been in a scholarly article and no one would have noticed it. It wasn't a quote, of course, it was a paraphrase, but it happened to be almost verbatim. And that's what he says he can refute, citing Benny Morris. And I'll give you the wording if you like, but that's the way it continues. It's a joke. Well, the question had to do with Russian policy throughout this whole period and the U-turn in it in recent years. Actually, there's been no U-turn. Russian policy throughout this period was right in the heart of the international consensus. I mean, there's all kind of issues you could talk about, but of the issues that I've been discussing, the diplomacy, Russia was no different from Western Europe as far as the diplomacy was concerned. They supported the international consensus since the mid-1970s. They continued to support it. Brezhnev put forth his own plan, which was approximately identical, and they backed all the UN resolutions. They were right in the core of the international consensus, and they still are. You know. I mean, there is a change in policy, but in lots of ways, but not on the diplomacy of the Middle East. I mean, because there really hasn't been any change in the international position. You know, slight modifications, but the international position, which has just been an overwhelming consensus, has been pretty stable. It's been blocked by the United States, but no one else. But doesn't exert much pressure. I mean, it did support the Arab states. So it supported the Arab states militarily. It gave some tepid support to the Palestinians, not amounting to much. But you know, that's part of the Cold War. If the United States militarily supports one side, the Russians support the other, and so on. But it had almost nothing to do with the diplomacy. Israeli military power was backed by the U.S. and Turkey and so on. It was just overwhelming. As I mentioned, by now Israel was more powerful than any NATO power. You know, it's not Russia, but you know, England, France, etc. Well, I mean, there are unpleasant things going on in the United States and internal to Israel, but by comparative standards, by world standards, the United States and Israel for Jews are both very free societies. So we're not under, you know, you don't have to be afraid of the police when you walk outside.
I'm saying for certain communities.
Yeah, sure, for marginalized communities, true, but that's always been true. In fact, it's been much worse in the past. I mean, look, it's not good now. A lot of terrible things are happening now. So what's happening, say, under the Patriot Act, it should not be tolerated in a democratic society. On the other hand, we should also be realistic. By comparative standards, either to the rest of the world or even to recent U.S. history, it's not out of sight. I mean, the programs of internal repression that ran through the Kennedy to Nixon administrations were much more serious than what's happening now. They're also not reported much because it's the wrong story, but COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which was run by the National Political Police, the FBI, from Kennedy, actually started under Eisenhower, mainly Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon until it was finally stopped by the courts, was theoretically at least, was far more severe repression than anything that exists now. I mean, it went all the way to political assassination. It was really no joke. And even that didn't begin to compare with Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, which was incomparably worse than either of them. So there has been a general improvement. I mean, Ashcroft would doubtless like to drive it back, and there's plenty of things that should not be tolerated. But the repression is restricted in the United States to highly vulnerable people. Of course, that's not a compliment, you know, and it shouldn't be tolerated. But it's realistic, and by comparison with other parts of the world, you know, it's hardly repression. And for Jews in Israel, it's the same. For Palestinians, of course, it's a vicious and harsh military occupation, as it's been for 35 years. I mean, it's different than it was in earlier years, you know. So, going to be more black faces in Harvard and MIT than there were 30 years ago. On the other hand, if you take a look at the prison population, I mean, it's just outrageous, you know. A huge part of the black and Latino population are simply thrown into jail. That's mainly what the drug war is about. It's a device for getting rid of superfluous people by tossing them into jail. And that certainly should not be tolerated. But again, you know, if you go back, say, to 30 years, 35 years, COINTELPRO reached the point of literally assassinating black organizers. Assassinating him. You know, Fred Hampton was murdered in his bed in a Chicago police raid set up by the FBI, probably drugged, murdered another guy too, and nobody cared. You know, in fact, I went to his funeral in Chicago. I think I was one of about 10 white faces in a huge black audience. And nobody cared. In fact, probably very few of you even know about it, because that was just what you do to people, you know. And that's not the only case. It happens to be the worst case. But that's not happening now. Bad things are, but not that. You know. This had to do with the assassination and the use of force by U.S. forces in Iraq and borrowings from Israel. That's been reported in the press in the last couple of days, the U.S. press and the British press, that U.S. government denies it, but reports are that they're getting Israeli intelligence to help them out with control of the population. Frankly, I tend to think that the U.S. government denials are probably accurate. The reason is that these kinds of vicious tactics are just second nature to military forces anyway. They don't have to get advice from anyone. It's not that there's some sophisticated techniques that we couldn't think of in 10 minutes. There was a limited number of ways of controlling people by violence. So maybe the denials are accurate, but it's probable that they're interacting. If you want to know what it is, they're telling you straight out, so there's nothing for me to say. There was a front page story, the lead story in the New York Times 3 or 4 days ago, a couple of days ago, was by Dexter Filkins. And, well, you read it yourself, but to me it seemed it was coming straight out of the Nazi archives. It quoted U.S. military officers as saying, the Arab mind understands only force and, honor or something, and went on to say the way you have to control these people is by showing them that you can use force and crush them, and then they'll respect you. Well, that's very familiar. You're all Harvard students. You've read history. You know exactly what page of history it comes from. Putting aside the Nazi archives, it comes straight out of the British Empire. Take a look at the Encyclopedia Britannica. I've got the edition that was given to me on my bar mitzvah, so it's an old edition. It's 1939. But if you look at the 1939 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and you look at the section on India, it's written by some British military officer who describes how the Punjabis, the military caste in India, enjoyed being beaten up. And when the British beat the shit out of them, they really respected the British for that. And after that, they kind of, followed what the British wanted. You think I'm exaggerating? Look it up. It doesn't say beat the shit out of, but other than that, it approximately says that. And that's the standard view about the natives. What you have to do is smash them in the face. They don't understand anything. They're barbarians. They like force. They love force, and they respect force. And when you do that, you got them under control. That's the Arab mind. If something like that were said about the Jewish mind on the front page of the New York Times, the country would explode. But when you say it about the Arab mind, it's okay. In fact, you can find distinguished Harvard professors who write things not very different from that, and nobody cares. So yes, the tactics are familiar. If they're getting them from Israel, I don't know. Maybe they are, but it's mostly second nature to conquerors. So suppose let's see if I understood it. If the United States secured its own resources, what would its strategy be in the region? Exactly the same as it is now, because it has nothing to do with U.S. access to those resources. And if you think about the history, you'll see that. I started from 1945, when the U.S. took over the region because it was a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Well, that would remain true at that time the United States was North America was the major oil producer in the world. The U.S. wasn't using those resources. In fact, the U.S. remained North America, that includes the Gulf and so on, was the major oil producer until I think around 1970. But it still had to maintain control of those resources. This is control, not access. If you look at U.S. Intelligence projections, contemporary U.S. intelligence projections for the next 15 years or so, they're public and worth looking at. They predict that the Persian Gulf will be even more important in the future. In fact, it'll provide about 2/3 of world energy resources in the next roughly 15 years, but the U.S. won't rely on them. They say the U.S. itself will rely on more stable West Atlantic Basin resources, like West Africa. It's one of the reasons for the concern and intervention in West Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Again, that's one of the reasons for the concern about the turmoil in the Andes, which are sort of getting out of control and a very likely target of U.S. military intervention, because that's regarded as one of the potential major energy resources. But even if the U.S., so they themselves are expecting to rely on resources that are less hazardous, more stable, but they still want to control the most, stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. In fact, if the U.S. went to renewable energy tomorrow, I don't think policy would change. This is a lever of world control. You control the Gulf energy resources, you pretty much control the world. And the material prize means huge profits. I mean, again, read this morning's, I think, front page of the New York Times. Yeah, front page, there's a story on how Halliburton is gouging you and your parents by charging ludicrous prices to import Kuwaiti oil into Iraq, about twice as much as Iraq and Kuwait pay. Yeah, that's a great material prize. It yields what one major historian of the oil industry called profits beyond the dream of avarice, and it still does for the future. That's even if we use renewable energy. And the stupendous source of strategic power remains. Controlling the world is not an easy business. It's a tough job for those guys in Washington. The international society is not dominated by the United States. From an economic point of view, the United States is just one of a number of equals. Europe's approximately like the United States. Northeast Asia has a greater gross domestic product than the U.S. does, considerably greater, about 50% greater, and holds about half of U.S. of global foreign exchange, and is the most dynamic region in the world. Also has resources. Actually, Laura Tyson, who was chair of the Council on Economic Advisors under Clinton, just described, a couple days ago, described the world economy briefly, very succinctly, in 4 words. He said, the world economy is based on the principle that America spends, Asia lends. And that's more or less accurate. And that's a very fragile situation. There's only one dimension in which the U.S. is overwhelmingly dominant, namely violence. That's why the Bush administration, which happens to be rather extreme, but it's not a pretty narrow spectrum, does want the world to be organized on the basis of force. It makes very good sense, You play your strong card, and the strong card for the United States is force, not economy, not culture, not other things. It's force. The U.S. spends roughly about as much as the rest of the world combined in military force, and is technologically far more advanced. Right now at the United Nations, if we had something like a free press in the country, what you'd be reading on the front page is what's going on at the General Assembly right now, every day. There's debates on the Disarmament Committee, the UN Disarmament Committee on Disarmament and International Security, or some such name, is having its meetings right now. And as usual, year after year this goes on unreported. The world is trying to block the militarization of space and the increase of nuclear weapons, and the U.S. is preventing it. That went on under Clinton. It's going on now. The U.S. is moving on to militarization of space, which is extremely hazardous, may destroy all of us. That's no joke. Right after the U.S. announced the National Security Strategy in September 2002, and the invasion of Iraq, same time, 2 months later, the Space Command publicly announced its plans for the next, I forget, 10 or 15 years, in which it said that the U.S. will move from control of space to ownership of space. Well, those of you who've read the National Security Strategy know what that means. We don't just control the world, we own it. And space we're going to own, which means nobody else gets near it. It's going to be used for platforms for offensive weapons, highly destructive weapons, nuclear, non-nuclear. They've adopted a first strike doctrine. The world's under complete surveillance. Hypersonic drones tell you if somebody's crossing the street in, Delhi or something like that. In theory, what's being worked on are systems which would enable a command post in the Colorado mountains to instantaneously attack and destroy any target in the world without warning, and they hope with impunity. Reduces the need for forward military bases, which cause various problems. People don't like them. That's sitting right there. So yes, the dimension of force is the dominant dimension, and the control over energy resources is a crucial part of this. 50 years ago, George Kennan, one of the top planners then, pointed out that control over Middle East oil gives the United States what he called veto power over, he was thinking of Japan at the time, but in fact everyone. A lot of the maneuvering in the Middle East and Central Asia, if you really look at it closely, is about the direction in which the pipelines will go and who's going to control production and transit routes. And that has to do with controlling Europe and Asia, Northeast Asia particularly, who understand it perfectly well. So they've been looking for their own independent access to energy resources all along. A lot of the maneuvering is about that. Again, in this morning's New York Times, you can read Paul Wolfowitz's memo saying that Germany and France will not be permitted to take part in what's called the reconstruction of Iraq. Well, partly that's just a reflection of the unbelievably passionate hatred of democracy by Wolfowitz and the Bush administration and others like them. I mean, they're furious at France and Germany because France and Germany, the governments took the same position as the overwhelming majority of the population, so therefore they have to be punished. The good guys like Italy and Spain, the government overruled an even larger majority of the population, so they got to be rewarded. It's kind of intriguing about the U.S. intellectual community that this can go on alongside of, odes to the love of democracy of Paul Wolfowitz and so on. So part of it is just the normal hatred of democracy, but it's more than that. France and Germany are the heartland of Europe. That's the industrial, commercial, financial heart of Europe. And if they get access to the Middle East, that's no good, because then they won't be under the thumb of the United States. We need that veto power. So go back to your question, we shift to renewable energy. I don't think anything would change. Who would the Palestinian leaders be with the greatest chance of negotiation success? Well, in my view, that's up to the Palestinians to decide, right? And the Palestinians have decided. I mean, when Bush made his speech about democracy that we were all supposed to worship a couple of weeks ago, it was mostly ridiculed in the Middle East and, in fact, most of the world outside of England for very simple reasons. If you look at what he said, he praised various democracies. These countries are advancing toward democracy. These are not so good, and so on. It had absolutely nothing to do with democracy. Anybody who knows about the countries knows that no correlation. But it had a very good correlation to willingness to accept U.S. orders. So if you were following U.S. orders, you were progressing toward democracy, just kind of like Italy and Spain, as distinct from France and Germany. But what's striking about the Middle East is that there is one elected leader. There's one genuinely elected leader in the region, one, elected by supervised elections. Probably not perfect, but I doubt that they were worse than the 2000 elections. Who did they elect? Well, Yasser Arafat. He's the one elected leader in the region. So what does the Bush administration have to say about him? Out, That's because of our love of democracy and our grand vision about democracy. I mean, I don't like him personally. I wouldn't have voted for him, but it's not up to me, that he was elected by the Palestinians. If you want to know which leader should negotiate, well, let the Palestinians pick a leadership. They've already done it. Let them pick another one. But let them do it, not Washington, not Paul Wolfowitz, or other people whose contempt for democracy goes beyond discussion. Let them do it themselves. I think there are better choices, but who am I to say? It's there for them to say. And in fact, as far as Arafat is concerned, whatever you think about him, he has, by comparison, on these issues, by comparison with American or Israeli leaders, he's been far more willing to accept a diplomatic settlement. In fact, that's been considered the problem. Ever since the mid-'70s, he's been pressing for a political settlement. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 with U.S. backing, again, otherwise they couldn't have done it, and killed about 20,000 people and destroyed most of the South, it had nothing to do with self-defense. They didn't even pretend that it did. It had to do with getting rid of the PLO, which was becoming Arafat, as one of Israel's leading scholar on the Palestinians put it, very conservative guy, no doubt, Yehoshua Barat, he said that Arafat's insistence on diplomacy and negotiations are what he called a veritable catastrophe for Israel. So we got to put an end to it and return them to terror, which we like, but not negotiations, which we don't want. It was a war for the West Bank, it was called by the highest political and military echelons. Because they were pressing for a political settlement. The U.S. and Israel didn't want it. If you want somebody to negotiate for a diplomatic settlement, there's a choice. I mean, the people who the Palestinians elected, who happens to have been trying to do it for the last, since the mid-'70s. My choice? No, but it's not up to me to decide. So the comment is that since 9/11, Israel has framed its actions in the context of the war on terror. So anything it does is part of the U.S. war against terror, right? And the question is, how would that framing of the issues, how would it affect U.S. government policy? Well, actually, U.S. government policy is so, like every state, is so completely hypocritical that it doesn't make any difference. But and the U.S. is not alone in this respect. But the framing, you're correct about the framing, but remember, it's not Israel. It's just about every country in the world. So Russia, for example, was carrying out vicious atrocities in Chechnya, immediately reconstructed what it was doing as part of the war on terror, figuring they'd get a pat in the head from Washington, which they did. So the U.S. now supports openly the Russian monstrous atrocities in Chechnya. And every other government in the world did approximately the same thing. I mean, Israel and the West Bank, Indonesia and Aceh, everywhere. Other governments like the United States or England, and in fact most, instituted some kind of repressive legislation to control their own populations, usually called Protection Against Terrorism Acts or Patriot Act or something like that. Had almost nothing to do with terrorism, had a lot to do with population control. So yes, the natural response of any power system, any state, to September 11th was to increase its power and repression under the pretext of defense against terror, and Israel did the same thing. But it's across the board. You have to look hard to find an exception. Is Israel defending itself against terror? Well, take a look. Every day there's an article about the separation wall, right? This wall that's snaking through the West Bank. The Security Council and the General Assembly have tried to block it. U.S. stops it, vetoes it as usual. And the justification, it's leaving a couple 100,000 Palestinians essentially in limbo. They're deprived of their lands. They'll have to get out. Sooner or later they'll get out. One of the leading Israeli commentators, Amir Ahas, describes it as a step towards expulsion. It probably is. It's described as needed for protection of Israel, for security. Is it? Think about it for a second. Think about it for 1 second. Suppose you wanted to build a wall to protect Israel. Where would you put it? Well, you'd put it a couple of miles inside Israel. If you put a wall a couple of miles inside the Green Line, you could build it 100 feet high if you want. You could have the Israeli army patrolling on both sides. You could mine it with nuclear weapons. You could do anything you want, and you wouldn't get one word of international protest. And nobody could pass it. It would be an impenetrable wall. So if security is the issue, that's what you do. You don't increase security by putting a couple 100,000 Palestinians inside the wall. Well, that is so obvious that it really takes genius not to see it. Now, ask yourself if there is a single comment anywhere pointing out that this thing can't possibly be for protection of Israelis. It's impossible. That's not where you'd put it. So why not do it that way? Well, because if you do it that way, you don't steal Palestinian land. You inconvenience Israelis who'd have to go through gates instead of Palestinians who have to go through gates that are never open. So therefore, it's no good. Well, that tells you what the wall is about. Okay, it has nothing to do with security, except for security for the Israeli settlements, which are illegal anyway. But so it's just a way of taking over, of advancing the U.S.-Israeli program of gradually integrating the valuable parts of the territories inside Israel, now under the pretext of security. But the pretext is so ludicrous in this case. You really have to admire the commentators who can't see it. You know? And as far as I'm aware, that's 100%. I've never seen a word pointing out the obvious, which is obvious on a moment's reflection, that if you want a wall that's going to secure Israelis from West Bank infiltration, you put it 2 miles inside Israel. You know? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Can you think of a fallacy?
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. If I could just go plug, a lot of the sources which you quoted from recent news stories are on that website. So it's a good resource because Professor Chomsky can't be here for all of us every day. Just my one question. The Associated Press this morning, and this has been going on for a while, talked about how OPEC is thinking of changing to the euro. Is this a big deal? Or is it
it's a big deal. It's a very big deal. I mean, if you look at the international financial, discussions, the euro is sort of creeping up on the dollar in terms of value. I mean, by now, it's overvalued. But I mean, as a currency that people are willing to rely on, it's creeping up on the dollar. If you look at bonds that are issued, it used to be overwhelmingly dollar. Now it's close to 50-50 dollar-euro. And in many respects, the euro is a more stable currency, safer currency. So Europe, for example, doesn't have the huge U.S. trade deficit. It's not the case that Asia lends and Europe spends, to quote Laura Tyson. And people understand that. Sooner or later, Asia, OPEC, and others are going to start probably using a basket of currencies, not just the dollar, but a mixture. And they might shift over to the euro. The effect of that on the U.S. economy, I mean, nobody can really predict, but it could be extremely serious. The U.S. economy is a very fragile system. It's a very rich country and enormous advantages, but the way it's being handled economically is just a disaster. And the world knows it. They're willing to support it for some time, but when that'll break down, nobody knows. And the potential that OPEC might switch to, even in part, to the euro, as it might do, is serious. In fact, that's one of the reasons, I think, why the U.S. wants to ensure military control over the region, so that the facade doesn't get any funny ideas. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave. Sorry.